Sometimes something unexpected will happen in your life, and then it will happen again, and then it will happen again. And after a while, however uncomfortable, it just becomes part of your everyday life, which is exactly what happened to me and my folks as we were trying to figure out how to deal with these ongoing and really quite painful ear infections that happened throughout my entire childhood, which is why I found myself carefully watching the new ear, nose, and throat doctor as he sat down on his stool and leaned forward to speak with my parents. Now, as usual, I was just dwarfed by the exam chair, like I was by most of the adult world right then. But the doctor was explaining my problem. He said, "Demons! Demons have entered his brain and must be expelled, or his head will explode." Okay, maybe he didn't use the word demons. And after all, we were United Methodists. What did we know about demons? Unlike my Southern Baptist buddies who could describe them in very great detail. And it certainly felt like their claws were scrabbling around inside my ears while they inflated their bulbous bellies until my head throbbed, and then they pinched my sinuses, whatever they were, and I couldn't go to school. So what he probably said was, "Fluids! Fluids behind his eardrum must be expelled, or his head will explode." Okay, so maybe he didn't wring his hands like that either. But years later, both my mom and my dad told me that he had always had a tight, distant little smile. And so 2, 3, even 4 times a year, my head would throb, my ears pulsed, my sinuses ached, as yet another mysterious infection made its way through my system from the top of my head down into my bowels, where it would ricochet around for a while. And I couldn't go to school again. Oh, when I was 8 years old, they took my tonsils out because they felt that solved so many things. Only it didn't. And so when I was around 11, our regular doctor referred us to that new ENT I was telling you about. And I found myself in that oversized exam chair. And out of the corner of my eye, I could see stainless steel instruments glittering on a tray. And the doctor was explaining to my folks how fluids, oh yes, fluids behind his eardrum build up pressure and encourage infections. Oh, infections, but he, oh yes, he would relieve that pressure, drain the fluid, encourage healing. He would do it right now by puncturing my eardrums. What? No one had talked to me about that. But he spun on his stool so he could skate across the floor to stand just behind the exam chair. And he reached for that tray of instruments, but his fingers fumbled for a moment, so the stainless steel clicked and then clicked together again until he raised that lancet up into the light as if it were Excalibur and he was Arthur. It was so sharp, I couldn't even see where the point ended. But he turned me on my shoulder, draped a towel over my shoulder, told me to hold very, very still, and then slowly pushed the lancet through my eardrum. And obviously, What happened after that was a good deal of whining, a tear or two. Okay, maybe even some crying, which was not how I saw my 11-year-old United Methodist self. And the demon extraction process happened 3 times over the next year. And each time the pressure released, and each time the infections got better, and each time I didn't cry as much, at least until I realized I had to turn over so he could lance the other eardrum. But throughout this time, my folks had begun to look for a more permanent solution. And besides, as my dad told me again years later at one of those throwaway comments around the kitchen table, that they had always felt that behind that tight, distant little smile, he had been enjoying himself just a little too much. And so our regular doctor referred us to yet another ENT at a hospital this time. In fact, the same hospital where I'd had my tonsils out. And he examined me on an exam table like I was used to. I mean, finally, no more doctors with hard, distant little smiles. No more shiny, sharp swords. No more sudden pain. No more tears. And my new doctor looked at my folder one more time and then sat down on his stool to lean forward and speak with my folks. Now, over the last decade, perhaps a little bit longer, there has been considerable experimentation, careful research that lets us know that atomic radiation is our friend and the enemy of so many ailments. Now, the only thing I knew about atomic radiation were from the films at school, where happy animals sang, duck and cover, duck and cover, hands overhead, low to the ground. You'll be safe when the bombs are falling down. Now, the doc looked over at me, and I know he could see that film playing behind my eyes. But, he just smiled and shook his head and said, "Now, I want to assure you that radiation therapy will not make you glow in the dark." And all of the adults laughed. And, I hadn't been worried about that until then. I mean, just, my head exploding. But he'd already turned back to my folks. Now, radiation therapy will dry up the tissues in his ears and his sinuses, prevent those fluids from building up, and I think we can help you avoid a considerable number of those infections. And it won't hurt a bit. Which was a convincing argument. And so the following week, my folks and I came back to the hospital for my first treatment. And I stood there in that big lobby feeling just, well, dwarfed by all of the healing that was going on around me, like when I'd been there for my tonsils. I couldn't remember a whole lot about that, only that after the operation, all I had to do was lie there in my bed and eat as much ice cream as I possibly could. Oh, and talk like my Aunt Johnny, who had smoked 2 packs of Camels every day for decades. "Stevie boy, how are you feeling? You look a little pale." But now I stood there in the middle of that large lobby wondering what kind of food was coming with radiation. Now, my mom and dad knew where they were going, but that turned out not to be the hospital, because we walked through the lobby. We walked back outside again to follow this curving sidewalk. It was lined with lush green grass, shaded with these thick, knobby trees toward the back of the lot, where there was a squat block brick building, no windows, as if they didn't want the radiation healing happening too close to the rest of the healing. And the waiting room had a linoleum floor, a couple of chairs, and finally, a guy in a white lab coat, yet another doctor who welcomed us warmly, reminded us that atomic radiation was our friend, and then catching my folks' eyes, he added, which we control very, very carefully. And then placing his hand gently between my shoulder blades, he urged us all toward the next small room, adding, so there's nothing to worry about. None of the adults mentioned that this was October 1962, which was the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where every conversation I heard about atomic radiation always began with duck and cover, duck and cover. In the next small room, a technician stood in front of this dark panel. It was just covered with dials and switches and knobs. And he leaned forward, flicked a switch, nodded to my doctor, who slowly pulled open this 6-inch thick lead door. It had one of those glass block windows so we can keep an eye out on you. Now, in the next slightly larger room, 5 matte gray blocks of metal just seemed to float in the still air. A couple of them were hovering almost at the ceiling. 2 more had settled part way down the back wall, while the last one hovered just right at my eye level. And from each, an 8-inch black cone distended from their bulbous bellies like every demon Bobby had ever told me about after church. And at my feet, well, there was a hospital gurney so low that it was easy for me just to roll onto it, while the doctor turned me on my side and adjusted this hard little pillow so my head would stay just so, and then he pushed me under the nearest demon. I heard a buzz out of the corner of my eye. The cone moved directly over my head, and in a series of short, sharp clicks, it dropped until it almost touched my head, and the doc patted my foot. Stay real still. We'll be back in 3 minutes. And then talking to my folks in a low voice about how safe the procedure had become these last few years, he slowly pushed the lead door shut with a thunk that reverberated through the floor, up the gurney wheels, and into the hard little pillow under my head. And the technician peered through the tiny window, and the demon began to hum, and it continued to hum, and then it stopped humming, and the door opened. And the doc and my folks came back in, and they rolled me out from underneath the machine. My dad helped me up. My mom stood behind me, holding me against her while they talked for just a moment more until I looked up to tell them that it didn't hurt. And my mom squeezed me tighter, and the doc said, well, of course not. And the following week, you'll be back for your other ear, and well, the week after that, we'll do your sinuses. And in hopes of finally figuring out just what the heck those were, I looked up at him, that question in my big, blue, innocent eyes, and he leaned down and he touched me right between the eyes. We both laughed. And then the weeks after that, you'll be back for your ears and then your sinuses. And he quickly ran his finger down my schedule and closed the folder. And the infections went away. Okay, mostly. Okay, at least I didn't get any more sick than my buddies got sick. And over the years, a lot of my buddies stopped believing in demons. Of course, over that same time, I had always felt just, well, dwarfed by any sort of medical procedure, no matter how well intended, and always so out of my control. But sometimes lying in my bed late at night, the demons peer in at my window, humming softly to themselves. And just beneath that soft buzz in my ears, I think I can hear like a Geiger counter. I mean, I'm sure I can hear my thyroid ticking. That's right.